This episode is brought to you by the Marine Corps Association and Foundation. Do you like to run? Do you like to walk? Do you like to bike? Like to go for a swim? You sound like a Marine. And you're in luck. You can do all of those things by participating in the Marine Corps Birthday Run. Join us in celebrating the Marine Corps' 249th birthday with the Run for Marines virtual 10K on November 10th, 2024. Whether you run, walk, bike, or swim, it's your chance to honor our Marines and the birth of our Corps. The first 100 participants get an exclusive racing pin. Sign up today at mca-marines.org/event/for-run-4-marines-10K-4. Hey Scuttlebutt listeners, this is episode 170. This week, we began our newest segment, Road to 250, in celebration of the Marine Corps' 250th birthday in 2025. Over the next year, we'll be featuring stories and history from throughout the 250 years of the Marine Corps. These episodes will be nested within the MCA's overall Road to 250 campaign, where you will find featured articles in both the Gazette and Leatherneck highlighting events and battles within specific periods of Marine Corps history. The MCA also has a commemorative Road to 250 coin collection. These commemorative challenge coins can only be found through the MCA. Email customerservice@mca-marines.org to pre-order or learn more. This month, we begin with the Continental Marines, and I can't imagine having a better guest to share the rich and little-known history of the birth of the Corps than we do today, Major General Jason Bohm, USMC retired. Major General Bohm's last duty was serving as the Inspector General of the Marine Corps. He is currently the Dean of Liberty University's Helms School of Government and the author of From the Cold War to ISIL, One Marine's Journey, and Washington's Marines, The Origins of the Corps and the American Revolution, 1775 to 1777. Major General Bohm takes us beyond the hallowed stories of New Providence and shows us how employing Marines has been critical to American military success since before the founding of our nation. This is a great conversation, and we are so excited to be kicking off our Road to 250 with Major General Bohm. Here is episode 170. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your continued support. I'm Vic. I'm here with William.
Howdy.
And we are really excited to be kicking off what we're calling Road to 250, and it's our celebration of the Marine Corps' 250th birthday, and we're going to do it 12 months. We're going to do it for the year, and the Marine Corps Association will be doing every month. We'll be having certain vignettes, previous articles, exposés on the history of the Marine Corps through 1775 to current. And we at Scuttlebutt will be doing one episode a month, starting with the Colonial Marines. And I can't think of a better way to not only talk about this subject, but to kick off this program than having Major General Jason Bohm on the show. Sir, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Vic. I appreciate both of you and what you're doing.
I mean, this is like Marine Corps, like mythology having you on the show, sir, like legendary status. So we're super excited. And then you being obviously an expert on colonial Marines and Revolutionary War stuff. But for those who maybe have been under a rock, since the Cold War and don't know, Major General Bohm, you are a retired Major General, the former Inspector General of the Marine Corps, and currently are the Dean of the Helms School of Government at Liberty University. Sir, again, thank you so much for being on the show. If you wouldn't mind, could you just tell us a little bit about your career? I know one of your first books that you published talked about basically being from the Cold War to ISIS. So could you tell us just a little bit about who you are and what your time in the Marine Corps was like?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that. I don't necessarily want to talk a lot about myself, but you're right. I did come in at the tail end of the Cold War, and it was interesting because at that time, I distinctly remember playing a war game, and I played the Soviet Sixth Army commander in that war game. So we were preparing for an existential threat of engaging the Soviet Union, a peer competitor at that time. And then, obviously, shortly right before I became on active duty, the Soviet Union collapsed. And that changed the strategic environment and would change the very way that the US military, the Joint Force, and the Marine Corps specifically would engage in operations across the world from that point on. So everyone should be familiar with the fact that the president establishes the national security strategy, which informs the national defense strategy written by SecDev, and then the Marine Corps uses that to develop its part of the national military strategy that the Joint Chiefs of Staff put out, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And that NMS has evolved throughout my entire career based off of the strategic environment. And obviously, we dealt with things like the global war on terror, lots of humanitarian operations, and lots of combat, unfortunately, because of that as well. What I will tell people is if you know your history, and it all started in 1775, the United States has gone to war an average of once every 15 to 16 years. But in between each of those major conflicts, the United States has participated in literally hundreds of operations short of war. And they've been called different things throughout our time: banana wars, small wars, mutual, military operations other than war. But the reality is the force of choice during those major operations short of war has been the United States Marine Corps since the birth of our nation. And so that has been the great joy of my career, is being able to participate in several of those operations throughout my time, whether it be in Haiti and Somalia, or overseas in Africa, Europe as part of NATO, or obviously all of us have a lot of time in the Middle East. So all of that, everything that we've done, and the legacy that we're trying to live up to, all began back in 1775 with the Continental Marines. So personally, I took it as a journey. As a Marine, we understand the importance of our history and our tradition, and I saw that as a gap in my own knowledge. So I started deep diving into conducting research about the birth of our Corps and what the truth behind the myth, as you stated, was out there, and then being able to share that story more broadly. And so I'm very happy to do that with Washington's Marines.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. And what a great title. For myself, very I guess more Eastern and Middle Eastern focus through my academic studies, and then particularly the Marine Corps. It being a participant in the Long War, almost since its, basically since its beginning. I'm not very savvy on sort of the birth of our country, and in particular the birth of the Marine Corps, which I'm sort of embarrassed to admit. But you get sort of the stuff that helps you with your BST knowledge, through entry-level training, stuff that helps you pass the quiz and get the grades so that I don't end up in the bottom of the bottom third at TBS. And then we're just so focused on sort of heaps and deployments and rotations and things that it's very easy to just accept our mythology and sort of smell our own farts and how great we were, but you don't really realize.
Like a true Marine there, Vic.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm an Amtracker, sir. Smelling farts is actually a good day.
Yes.
Yes, sir. So beyond a new providence, I think that's the thing that many of us hang our hat on. And one of the beautiful things about your book, and I'm rambling and I apologize, but was how not only do we go beyond New Providence, but you also give us the context of why New Providence was so important, but then also why Washington calling on Marines to help was also so important, because of all of these sort of skirmishes that you alluded to that the Marines were participating prior to Lexington and Concord, so and Trenton. So I guess thank you for writing this book. I've just been absolutely fascinated with it. And yeah, so I know you alluded to a little bit about the impetus behind it, but when did you really decide, like, I want to dive into this thing because there's such an engaging story here beyond just the first, recorded amphibious assault?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it was the fact that I had the great honor to command Marine Corps recruiting. And running up to that, I realized how important it was to tell the Marine Corps story. And as I mentioned, this was research I was doing on my own. I think we all do our own self-study of Marine Corps history. And like I said, I started deep diving into the origins of the Corps, and I started finding all these nuggets of information that I never knew about. And I had been in the Marine Corps for 30 years. And so I thought, this is something I can't keep to myself. I got to get the word out there. And then, of course, Marines are always focused on mission. So my thought was, if I can get the Marine Corps story out there and get people talking about the Corps, that's going to be good for the recruiting effort as well. And I am very proud of our recruiters who, oh, by the way, continue to be the only service that continues to make mission during the most difficult time in recruiting history since the inception of the all-volunteer force in 1973. So well done to our Marine recruiters out there.
So just sort of gear this conversation to the myth versus historical. There's the mythical foundation of the Marine Corps, which is like it was founded by a bunch of guys in a bar. So to start off our conversation, General, do you mind just first identifying what is the myth of the Marine Corps Foundation, and then leading us into the truth and how it actually really started?
Sure. So thanks, William. And to be clear, we were born in a bar. And so that is a true statement, but it's a little bit different than what people think. Everyone knows about Tun Tavern. And Tun Tavern was owned by a gentleman named Robert Mullen. And Robert Mullen was not commissioned in the Marine Corps until the second iteration of commissions that were granted by the Continental Congress that occurred in 1776. So we'll come back to the Continental Congress and Tun Tavern here in a moment. But as everyone knows, our first officer was commissioned in November of 1775, a year prior, and that was Samuel Nicholas. And Samuel Nicholas was the proprietor of another tavern, not Tun Tavern, but the Conestoga Wagon Tavern in downtown Philadelphia as well. And so John Hancock, a name that some of you may recall, was the president of the Continental Congress, and he signed Samuel Nicholas's commission to make him the senior Marine in the Marine Corps. Now, this is one of the myths. Samuel Nicholas, although we teach it in boot camp, and it's even identified on his painting inside the Pentagon, people mistakenly refer to him as the first commandant of the Marine Corps. Not true. And the reason for that is because the Congress did not bestow the title commandant of the Marine Corps until 1790 to William Burrough, well after the end of the American Revolution. And so, although it's true he's the first and senior Marine officer, he was never officially called commandant. So that's the first thing. So Samuel Nicholas is responsible. He is commissioned with two other officers, and they go out and they start recruiting their first Marines in the Philadelphia area. And this first group of Marines who were recruited in Philadelphia, their first deployment was to New Providence. But this is another part of the story about the Marine Corps that people don't know. Everyone knows that it was in November 10th, 1775, that the Continental Congress resolved to create 2 battalions of Marines. And those 2 battalions of Marines were supposed to replicate the structure of Army battalions at the time and have an overall commanding colonel in charge of the 2 battalions that would each be commanded by lieutenant colonels, and then have structure that we're used to in a battalion structure today. The purpose for the Marine battalions being formed was not for service with the fleet initially. It was to conduct a naval campaign to capture Nova Scotia, Canada. And the way that happened was there's a community up there called Passamaquoddy, Nova Scotia. And the people from Passamaquoddy wrote to the Continental Congress and asked to become part of the Association of North Americans fighting for their freedoms and liberties. So the Congress was salivating and said, this is a golden opportunity to bring Canada into the American fold as an American 14th colony. And Nova Scotia would become important because that is where Halifax is located, which was the principal Royal Navy base of operations for the whole North American squadron for the British Royal Navy at the time. So the people of Passamaquoddy not only asked to become part of the Association of North Americans. To be clear, they never asked to be a 14th colony. It was the Continental Congress who came up with that idea. But the Continental Congress, once they received this letter from Passamaquoddy, the people of Passamaquoddy also recommended that the Americans create a naval campaign to capture Halifax, because that would take away the British's ability to resupply, reinforce, and repair their ships in their principal naval base in the North American continent. They had other places to go on the American continent, but if we were to go to war with them, which we did, we would basically occupy those other major ports, making it more difficult for the British to operate on the seas. So the Congress decided we are going to do this. And when they resolved on November 10th, 1775 to create the 2 battalions of Marines, they actually originally went to George Washington. And they said, Washington, you form these 2 battalions of Marines, and you're going to do it by cherry picking people out of the Continental Army who have experience operating on the seas. And if you know any of your American history, there was another group called the Marblehead Mariners under a guy named John Glover, which did exactly that. They were the ones that ran the boats that helped Washington escape from Long Island in the Battle of Long Island. And they were the ones that manned the boats that took Washington across the Delaware River. They were seafaring men who joined the Army militia, the Massachusetts militia, which later became the 14th Continental Regulars. So the same concept was at play here, where the Congress told Washington, cherry pick people out of your battalions who have seafaring experience to create these 2 battalions of Marines. And then Washington was supposed to lead the campaign to capture Halifax. Now, for context, at the time, Washington is leading the Continental Army in the siege of Boston after Lexington and Concord had occurred. And he was short personnel. He was short professional soldiers because the Army did not even exist at this point. He was trying to organize them into a cohesive fighting force, and he lacked all manner of supply and weapons. So he looks at this letter from John Hancock, the president of Continental Congress, and says, you got to be flipping crazy. I don't have the bandwidth to do this. I'm not going to pull people out of my battalions that are already shortly manned to create new battalions of Marines, and I don't have the time or resources to lead a campaign to capture Halifax, Nova Scotia. So John Hancock said, okay, George, don't worry, you're off the hook, but we understand the value of having men that can fight on the land and the seas. So we are still going to create from scratch this organization called the Continental Marines. So Washington was off the hook, and the naval campaign to Nova Scotia was put on hold, and the Continental Congress started the forming of the Marines at that point by first commissioning Samuel Nicholas, another guy named Shoemaker, and a third guy named Welsh. Welsh is going to come into play later in the Penobscot expedition. But they recruited their force. They recruited approximately 234 Marines, but the Congress did not pursue the thought of conducting a naval campaign against Halifax. Rather, what they did was they organized those Marines into ships companies, or what modern day Marines are used to calling ship detachments, and they went to sea with the First Fleet of the Continental Navy that was formed in Philadelphia. And as a sidebar, the flagship, all of the ships in the first fleet were converted merchant ships. We had no ships that were built from the keel up as warships, all converted merchantmen, but the largest and the flagship of the fleet was called the Alfred. And the Alfred was commanded by a guy named Dudley Saltonstall, which will matter in a minute, but his first lieutenant was a name you may recognize, was John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones' partner in crime on the Alfred and the Marine Detachment Commander was Samuel Nicholas. So Nicholas commanded the senior Marine Detachment of the First Navy Fleet side by side with John Paul Jones, and they sailed from Philadelphia in January 1775 with 3 sets of orders. And at the time, the Royal Navy had been conducting raids along the eastern seaboard, and they had actually burned down Norfolk, Virginia. They burned down Falmouth, Maine, which is modern-day Portland, Maine. And because of that, the Congress wanted the fleet to go out there, seek out, engage, and destroy the Royal Navy fleets, operating first from the Virginia Capes. Then once that was done, they were supposed to go down to the Carolinas and take on the fleet operating off North and South Carolina. And then once that was done, they were supposed to go up to Rhode Island and destroy the British fleet operating there. Now think about this. These are converted merchant ships with low caliber cannons, first cruise ever, not a professional Navy, not a professional Marine Corps at the time. And they're supposed to go out and take on the world's most powerful Navy with frigates and ships of the line. So Commodore Hopkins actually had a caveat in his orders that said, if the weather doesn't permit or other circumstances don't permit, use your own judgment and do what you think is best. And what he chose to do was he knew that Washington and the Army holding the British under siege outside of Boston was critically short on gunpowder. In fact, Washington's soldiers only had enough gunpowder to fire 9 rounds a man. Now, if the British decided to push out of Boston and fight them in the surrounding area, the Americans would have lost because they would have been out of ammo right away. Same thing that happened in Bunker Hill, why they had to evacuate Bunker Hill. They ran out of ammo, not because they were being defeated. So Hopkins had earlier received an intelligence report that said down in Providence, Bahamas, there's 2 forts down there, one called Fort Nassau, guarding the western approach to Nassau Bay, and another called Fort Matangao, guarding the eastern approach to Nassau Bay. And he knew that there were British cannons and lots of gunpowder down there. So he sets course and he takes the first fleet with Samuel Nicholas and the 1st Continental Marines 1,000 miles south. And when they were right outside of the territorial waters of New Providence, Isaac Hopkins, who was the Commodore, pulls in Samuel Nicholas and says, you're going to create a landing force by combining the ship detachments into a 234-man battalion. And you're going to go in, you're going to capture these 2 forts, capture the gunpowder so we can, and cannons there, and bring them back up to support Washington and the Continental Army. Well, what happens is the winds push the fleet too far south and they get spotted. So a surprise attack was out of the question. So what Hopkins does is he gives Samuel Nicholas 50 sailors to go ashore with him. So they have this combined joint force, if you will. They land, they capture Fort Matangao first, and then the following day, they capture Fort Nassau. There were approximately 300 British militiamen down there in the area. The regular troops had already been transferred up to North America, and there wasn't really a fight. The British fired a few cannonballs towards the Marines just to say they weren't cowards, and then they ran. But basically, we carried both forts without a fight. Unfortunately, Hopkins had not established a good picket line with his ships, and the British evacuated a lot of the gunpowder to Florida the night before the Marines captured Fort Nassau. but they still captured an enormous amount of cannons. They did capture some gunpowder, and those cannons were used throughout the New England area all the way down to Virginia once we did bring them back up north. I'll pause there.
That's it's really fascinating stuff. So the idea that Washington was initially against the Marine Corps, it seems almost nefarious, as if there's some sort of like land versus maritime rivalry going on, but it really was more that he didn't have the manpower to support the development of a new organization.
And the interesting point is that the Marine Corps has been under attack by the Army ever since. That service rivalry still exists. And if you look at the presidents who have tried to abolish the Marine Corps since its inception, Washington, former soldier; Truman, former soldier; Eisenhower, former soldier. So there's that tension that exists between the Army and the Marine Corps. And when we're talking about fighting for resources, just like they did back in 1775, big armies always looking to push little Marine Corps off to the side. And it's only because of our connection to the Congress and having several Marine veterans in the Congress and good work of organizations like the Chowder Society that we still exist today.
Really sorry, William, but one question though, as we're talking about sort of the beginnings of the Marine Corps, what was the composition of folks? Because I can't imagine, as we're seeing some of the struggles that the colonial militias were having, that there would have been a big a zeitgeist for getting fresh recruits. One, from the recruit standpoint, what was the taste for seafaring life, and that sort of understanding that, as soon as you raise your right hand, you're basically going into combat against the world's most dominant navy that the world had seen at the time. And then secondly, what was the appetite for, from their standpoint, that, hey, do we really want to be taking on the world's most dominant navy in history with a bunch of, green recruits? What was that like as we're starting out?
Sure, that's a great question. So to start out with, Americans are adventurous, and Americans don't back down. So in fact, the greatest challenge to recruitment for the Navy and the Marine Corps was not a fear of the British. It was the privateers that were operating out of American waters. Because initially, when we created the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, they, just like today, same debates, their pay wasn't very good. And it didn't compete well with privately owned vessels that were given letters of marque from the Continental Congress to basically be sanctioned pirates to go out and capture British merchant ships and warships if they could. So these privately owned vessels, just like we converted the merchantmen to create the first continental fleet, converted their merchant ships into warships, and they would go out and they would capture these British merchantmen that were not well protected, and then they could bring them into a friendly port and sell them, and then they got to split the prize money between the crews and the officers of the ships. And so that was actually the bigger challenge for recruitment for Marines and sailors, was to be able to compete equally with somebody who was more about getting the bigger money and wasn't necessarily about fighting for their independence and their freedom. So that was something that the Continental Congress had to struggle with, and they eventually increased, because at the time they had to allow Continental sailors and Marines, when they captured British warships, they got to sell them as well, and they got to keep a percentage of that prize money. But it wasn't as high as a percentage that privateers would get. So into 1776, later, and 1777, the Congress eventually increased the percentage of prize money Marines and sailors could get for capturing British ships. So they were driven by two things. They were driven by service to country, winning their independence and their freedom, but there was also a monetary aspect of this as well. And this is a good place to talk about how the recruiting worked. So, to your point, I mentioned a lot of people believe that Tun Tavern was the birthplace of the United States Marine Corps. Well, why is that? It wasn't necessarily because Robert Mullen, the owner of Tun Tavern, was commissioned as a Marine Corps officer, which is true. But as I mentioned, he was recruited in the second iteration of commissions of officers in the Marine Corps a year after the Marine Corps had already been established. And he did, in fact, the first two Marines he recruited was a fifer and a drummer, two brothers who went out on the streets of Philadelphia playing their instruments and with a coiled snake that said, "Don't tread on me," on the drum. And they were coaxing people into the tavern. And you and I both know they probably had a few free ales or beer once they got into the Tun Tavern to help them come to the decision of signing on. But the real reason Tun Tavern is known as the birthplace of the Corps is because the way the Congress operates is by creating committees. And the Congress created what was originally known as the Navy Committee and then became known as the Marine Committee. And their responsibility was to basically support the creation of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And there were three people that were part of that committee initially. And one of them was a name you'll recognize, John Adams, who became our second president and came from a maritime state, Massachusetts. So John Adams, Silas Deane, and John Langdon, they created the Marine Committee, and they met to come up with the plans that were briefed to the Congress on the 9th of November, which the full Congress voted on and resolved on the 10th of November to create the Continental Marines. And the place that they met was a second-story room inside Tun Tavern. And that occurred in October and November of 1775. And that's why Tun Tavern is truly the birthplace of the Marine Corps.
Fascinating.
So it wasn't just a bar; it's a tavern. They have, places for you to stay. So it's an interesting story. So we talked about earlier, there was some initial pushback to having a Marine Corps, particularly from Washington. However, as the title of your book, Washington's Marines, suggests, that relationship changes. To what extent did it change, and what brought about the Washington, I guess, to perceive an importance of the Marine Corps?
Yeah, great question. So after the Continental Marines and the First Fleet did the operation in New Providence, they went up and they started operating out of New England waters. But what happened when they went up north is they were in the tropics, and several of them got tropical diseases. And so several of them had to go to the hospital when they went up to New England. So the fleet was kind of stuck in the New England area. Now, George Washington had successfully caused the British to evacuate from Boston because he put the cannons brought by Henry Knox from Fort Ticonderoga up on Dorchester Heights and basically had plunging fire into Boston, making the British position untenable. The British evacuate to Nova Scotia, and Washington now shifts his army to New York because he knows that's where the British are going to hit next. And in essence, what happens in August of 1776 is the British invade with an army of 32,000 soldiers, a combined force of British soldiers and Hessian mercenaries from Germany. What would become the country of Germany was not Germany at that point. Well, Washington had 19,000 basically green militiamen that had been transitioned into regular Continental forces. So 19,000 versus 32,000, and the Americans are novice. They do not know how to go head-to-head against the British Army in basically Napoleonic warfare that was being fought at the time. So Washington and his army get defeated in one battle after the other. The Battle of New York, Harlem Heights, White Plains, and they get forced into New Jersey. And then Lord Cornwallis and Lord Howe take the army under pursuit all the way across northern New Jersey until they cross in December of 1776 into Pennsylvania. What I mean by that is Washington and his army cross south of the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and they used the Delaware River as a natural barrier. And Washington had the forethought to make sure all the boats on the Delaware River were collected so that none were available when the British came in pursuit against them. Therefore, they could not cross the river, and Washington was safe for the time being. But that 19,000 soldiers that he started the New York, New Jersey campaign with had been reduced of those with him to only about 2,400. The British still had tens of thousands of soldiers that they could take to bear against him. And so it's December of 1776. Washington is been dwindled down due to desertion, disease, casualties, and terminating enlistments to this very small force. And the war is about to end. The British put their people into winter quarters because they don't have the boats to cross the Delaware. But they know that in the springtime, they're going to cross the river, finally defeat the army, and capture the capital of Philadelphia and end the war. Washington knows he has to seek the initiative. He has to seize the initiative back to the back onto the American side. Otherwise, the war is over. But he doesn't have the forces necessary to do what he needs to do. And so what he does is he establishes a defensive line on the river, and he starts to gather more forces together. He tells some of the Continental regulars up in New York to come down and join him. And then he writes to the Congress and says, I need your help. We're dramatically short on personnel here. And at the end of December and the beginning of July, the rest of those enlistments of the soldiers that are with him are going to hit, and those soldiers are going to go home. So the Continental Congress responds by sending two different groups to Washington. One group is a group that was originally created by Benjamin Franklin in 1747 during the French and Indian War prior to the American Revolution. They're called the Associators. And so the Philadelphia Associators are militiamen under a brigade commander named John Cadwalader. And that name is going to matter to the Marines here in a moment. The other group was the Continental Marines. So in December of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the first construction of 13 American frigates, the first American warships to be built from the keel up as warships. And 4 of those frigates were contracted to be built in Philadelphia. And when the fleet went back up to New England, actually Samuel Nicholas, because his ship was being held in port because of a lack of manpower, asked the fleet commander to let him go back down to Philadelphia to take care of some personal affairs down there. The Commodore sends Samuel Nicholas down with dispatches to brief the Congress on the success of the New Providence raid. And when he did that, the Congress promoted him to major, because he was a captain up to that point. So now Major Nicholas is responsible for leading the effort to recruit 4 companies of Marines to become the ship detachments on the 4 frigates being built in Philadelphia. When Washington asks for support, the Congress tells him, drop the frigates, we're going to detach you from the Navy, and we're going to attach you to the Army to fight as part of the Continental Army as a separate Marine unit under George Washington. Well, Samuel Nicholas puts his 3 of the 4 companies in gondolas, and they go up the Delaware River. The 4th company, under a guy named Captain Shaw, that belonged to the frigate Randolph, remained in Philadelphia because it was the closest ship close to being completed, and the Congress wanted to try and get the Randolph to sea so it couldn't get captured by the British. Samuel Nicholas and his 3 other companies, one of his company commanders was Robert Mullen, the owner of Tun Tavern. They all go up and they link up with Washington at Trenton, New Jersey. Now, the issue was that Washington had already had some distrust of the Marines because he had been told to form the Marines to begin with. He didn't agree with that. And he knew anytime we had Marines, they were going to try and suck resources away from his soldiers. So Washington doesn't really want to deal with the Marines and doesn't know how to deal with the Marines at first. But then John Cadwalder and his associators show up around the same time. So he looks at Cadwalder and he says, hey, go talk to that guy, Nicholas, and find out whether the Marines mean to fight on the land or are they going to fight on the water, i.e. the Delaware River. And the reason for that is because the Navy had sent some Continental ships, smaller ones, to work hand in hand with the Pennsylvania State Navy, not the Continental Navy, and there were Marines, state Marines, operating on the Delaware River. So Washington asked for clarity. Cadwalder goes back and said, General, they're here to fight for you. And so Washington says, very well then, sir, I place them under your command. So the Marine battalion that was formed by those 3 ship detachments under Major now, Samuel Nicholas, gets assigned to the Philadelphia Associators as a separate and distinct battalion to fight under Cadwalder's command. I'll pause there, and then we can get into the battles themselves here, unless you have a question prior to that.
Yes, go ahead, Wayne.
No, you go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, so what did the Marines anticipate their role was going to be, being that they arrived on ship, they're now fell under the Army, and now they're being commanded by, I guess, a third-party irregular.
Exactly. Basically an Army militiaman.
Yeah.
And so their orders that Samuel Nicholas received from the Continental Congress said, basically, go find Washington and serve him any way you can for the duration of the war.
What do you anticipate that they felt, being
well,
that?
I think they knew they were going to be fighting a land campaign. And in fact, this became the Marines' first protracted land campaign in our history.
And do you think that they had to make a case? Because you had mentioned that of the folks replenishing Washington's lines, that they were pretty green. It seemed like most of the experienced fighters were either come to the end of the time in service or were dealing with some other issue. But yet the Marines were coming off one of the few successful campaigns that we had up to this point.
Yeah, and quite frankly, the Marines had some unique skills. As you know, they were marksmen because they would snipe enemy from the fighting tops of the ships. They had limited infantry skills because they could do limited campaigns ashore in support of a naval campaign. But there was another key skill that they had that your standard soldier didn't have. They knew how to operate naval cannons. And that would come into play in the coming days, particularly when the Army continued to lose soldiers. And I'll get to that point here in a moment. But to your point also, the Marines had been in battle up to that point, war at sea, fighting British, but they got those initial jitters out of their system, if you will. They had started to become a cohesive unit, and on board ship, everything has to run like clockwork and everyone has a key role. So discipline is really important on a ship. Otherwise, you're defeated and you lost at sea. So the Marines had that unique skill set to be able to bring as a somewhat of a seasoned battalion to support Washington and his force at the time. Particularly with the fighting side by side with the Associators. The Associators had not been blooded yet. They had not seen any combat up to that point.
As the resident gun junkie, you said the Marines were sharpshooters. Were they primarily armed with smoothbore flintlocks, or were they rifled flintlocks?
So it was a combination. At the start of the war, a lot of it was come as you are. But they were being supplied by the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety and the Continental Congress with standard Army muskets as well. But in the orders for arming the Marines, they were supposed to be armed with what's called a Freese, which is basically a short-barreled rifle to be able to fight on the confined spaces of the ships. They were even supposed to be armed with pikes, spears, basically, to repel boarders or to be used to gain foothold on enemy ships if they were to take over an enemy ship. Another interesting thing is a lot of people don't understand when the Marines did their first deployment down New Providence, there was no standard Marine Corps uniform. They wore whatever they had. And in fact, some of the uniforms that were worn were captured British uniforms, hussars, which are very colorful uniforms that light cavalry wear. And it wasn't until September of 76, right before they went to go support Washington, that they were issued the standard green uniform that most people know Continental Marines wearing.
Yeah, so they're about to go to the battle with some beautiful new uniforms. How's it go from there?
Yeah, so what happens is Washington has to cover 40 miles of riverfront with a very few number of soldiers and augmented Marines. So what he does is he spreads them out along the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, and the Marines are sent down to an area called Bristol, about 22 miles southeast of Trenton. And there they establish a guard duty rotation, and they start going across the Delaware River into New Jersey to collect intel and to conduct raids on the British and Hessian forces operating there. And there are some testimonies that identifies that the Marines were actively participating in that. But Washington uses that time to build his force and to collect intel, and he finally makes the decision to conduct a surprise Christmas Day attack on the Hessian force holding out in Trenton, New Jersey. But his operation, most people know about Washington crossing the Delaware, but that was only the main effort of that overall operation. There were actually 3 supporting efforts to assist Washington with that operation. So Washington was supposed to take the main force of 2,400 Continental regulars, cross at McConkey's Ferry, and march 9 miles south to attack the Hessians in Trenton at dawn on Christmas, the day after Christmas Day. The Marines and the Associators were actually still 22 miles downriver, and their job was as a supporting effort. They were supposed to cross the river and establish a blocking position to prevent the other Hessians operating further southwest from being able to reinforce the Hessians at Trenton. And then one group of militiamen was supposed to cross right over into Trenton and capture the bridge on the south side of Trenton to prevent the soldiers escaping that were in Trenton and also block any reinforcements that may come from the the east. And then there was a final group of militiamen that crossed over just north of Philadelphia. So on the night in question, the weather was terrible. And as you all know your history, there were ice cakes on the Delaware River. And in fact, that militia group that was supposed to cross straight into to Trenton never even attempted it because the conditions were too dangerous. Washington got across with about a several-hour delay in getting across the Delaware River at McConkey's Ferry. The conditions allowed for that. So he did get across and conduct his 9-mile hike, but he was about 4 hours delayed in his assault on Trenton. The Marines and the Associators got 2/3 of their force across, and then the conditions became too untenable. It was a nor'easter rolled in, and they couldn't land their artillery because the ice was forming on the shore and going further out into the river. And Cadwalader was concerned that he would lose his artillery. So he makes the call to abort the mission and brings the 2/3 of the force already ashore back into Pennsylvania. He's thinking that the rest of the force, including Washington, had the same issues because they don't have good modern communications at the time. So the next morning, he's on the Pennsylvania side. Everyone's ticked off because they got wet. They're tired. It's been a long night and they have nothing to show for it. And Cadwalader's writing a note to Washington recommending that he come down and join Cadwalader at his location, thinking that Washington is still in Pennsylvania. But all of a sudden he hears boom, boom, boom off in the distance in the direction of Trenton. son of a gun, and then he sees Hessians retreating rapidly along the north side of the Delaware River on the New Jersey side. So the Marines and the Associates are like, hey, let's go, get in the fight. So they cross the next day into New Jersey, and they start taking some Hessians under pursuit, trying to capture them as they're trying to escape up towards Princeton, where there's a British brigade holding out. When that happens, unknown to Cadwalader, is George Washington actually takes the 1,000 Hessian prisoners that he now has to deal with and crosses back into Pennsylvania. So now you have this flip-flop going on with the units. And once Cadwalader hears that Washington is back in Pennsylvania, he starts to get cold feet. And he's deciding he wants to abort that mission again. But Samuel Nicholas, the Marines, and some of the associate officers like, oh, hell no. We're here. We're fighting. We're not going anywhere. So Cadwalader actually writes to Washington and says, hey, look, we have them in a full retreat. We have the initiative. Recommend you come back over into New Jersey, which Washington does. And it's now the 2nd of January, 1777, and Washington decides to consolidate all of his forces at Trenton. He now has augmentation from Continentals that came from New York. He now brings the Associators and the Continental Marines all to the south side of Trenton, and he uses a creek called the Assunpink Creek on the south side of Trenton with that single bridge crossing it and high ground on his side as a defensive position where he can use the creek as a natural barrier from the British and Hessians trying to catch him. So the Marines are initially placed on the right flank of Washington's main force covering that bridge in order to cover a ford site on the northern side of the Assunpink Creek. The British show up later that day. They try to successfully force the bridge, but now Henry Knox has 40 cannons and Washington has several infantry units covering that bridge, and they decimate the British in the first attempt. But Washington starts to get concerned because the British have 10,000 soldiers on the other side of the river. He's only has about 6,000 total troops now with him. So he pulls the Marines off of the flanking position, and he brings them in to reinforce the main effort guarding that bridge. The British will try 2 additional times to try and force the bridge, but the combined fire of all the Continental forces forces them back. It's now nighttime. It's dark. Cornwallis doesn't want to try and attack into unknown territory during the daytime, so he pulls his forces back north of Trenton, and Washington is still holding the ground on the other side of Assunpink Creek. So Washington at this time has his back to the Delaware. He's got a larger enemy force on the other side of the river, and he's contemplating what he needs to do next. He knows Cornwallis is going to find a ford site and basically outflank him and push him into the Delaware River and defeat him. So Washington can either stay in place and hope that doesn't happen, or he can take the initiative and attack across the bridge himself to seize the initiative, but he's outnumbered nearly 2-1, or he can retreat further downriver, but he knows the British are just going to pursue him and eventually catch up to him. So what does he decide to do? He decides to attack deeper into the rear of the enemy-held territory. So in the middle of the night, he uses a militia group of 300 soldiers to stoke the fires and make a racket like they're preparing defensive positions, and then quietly pulls all of the forces, including Samuel Nicholas and the Continental Marines, out of the lines, and they march 11 miles further north to capture Princeton, New Jersey. And there's a brigade held out in Princeton where Washington wants to capture them because Cornwallis brought all of his force down to Trenton, 11 miles away. So in the next morning on the 3rd of July, it's right as dawn is coming. The sun's just starting to rise, and the combined force is now outside of Princeton, and they have what's called a meet and engagement. because what Washington doesn't know is that brigade commander received orders to leave Princeton and come down south to reinforce Cornwallis for the final attack to defeat Washington that morning at Trenton. So what occurs is there is a Continental brigade under a guy named Hugh Mercer, who's in the lead position. He starts a firefight with this British brigade that's now have this meeting engagement with the British. Samuel Nicholas and the Associators are down in the sunken road along this creek. They hear the fighting going on the high ground up in forward of them. So they start to come out of that high ground, and they form with the Associators in the center, and Samuel Nicholas and the Marines form on the right of the Associators, and they start to advance towards the British. The British that are fighting at this point outnumber the initial American unit that went on the high ground to engage them. Hugh Mercer's brigade turns and is in a full retreat. Hugh Mercer himself, the general, was kicked off his horse, bayoneted 13 times, and then his brigade hits the Associators and Marines in a full sprint trying to retreat off the battlefield. The Marines and the Associators get one volley of fire off, but that wave of people coming back at them forces them all to pull back about 150 yards. Nicholas and Cadwalader at this point are just getting their people reorganized, and George Washington shows up on the scene. And that's the painting that you see from Colonel Charles Waterhouse on the cover of Washington's Marines, is Washington's pointing to the British and saying, "Go get them, boys." And so the Marines turn around with the Associators. Now some Continentals coming on their flanks, and they attack back into the British. They counterattack, and they win the day. They win the whole battle. The British are in a full retreat right now. It's the third victory in 10 days for the Continental forces, which the Continental Marines participated in and would become known as the 10 Crucial Days. It was a turning point of the war. Otherwise, the war would have been over in 1776. Those three victories helped recruiting effort, because now all the local folks are all motivated that the Americans are kicking butt and they want to be part of that. And then there's one final thing that the Marines under Samuel Nicholas do during this campaign. Is Washington and his force have now faced the culminating point. They have been marching for 40 hours straight. They had no sleep, no food. They fought 2 battles. Now, Washington wants to continue attacking north and take the town of Brunswick. But his people are at the culminating point, which is that point that if you go beyond it, you will start to have diminishing returns. So Washington makes the wise choice to go up to Morristown, New Jersey instead, and winter there for the remaining winter months. But what he does is it starts what's called the Forge War, because the British and Hessians had evacuated all of eastern New Jersey, and they're now centered up in northern New Jersey. And they're all consolidated in one tight spot. They have to come out to find forage for their horses and food for their troops. And every time they do that, they're being attacked by Americans who are operating out of Morristown. So the Marines are participating in these small skirmishes until about the February timeframe. And then what happens is Henry Knox, who is in charge of the Continental Army's Artillery Corps, is looking around, and those terminating enlistments that I mentioned come into play. Because now Henry Knox has cannons, but he has no one to operate them because his soldiers left, leaving him with a bunch of empty cannons. So he's looking around the battlefield, and he looks over at Samuel Nicholas and the Marines. He goes, "Wait a minute. Those Marines know how to operate ship's cannons, which are very similar to his field guns." And so he goes to Washington and he requests to have the Marine Battalion assigned to the Corps of Continental Artillery. Washington approves, and then for the remaining few months that the Marines are going to participate in the Forge War, they are the Continental Army's artillery arm. All Marines manning those cannons. So incredible story. And a lot of Marines don't know. That was one of those hidden nuggets. I was like, what? You're kidding me. They worked for Henry Knox? Yes. And so they do that until they all are eventually sent back to Philadelphia to re-engage with their ships that are still under construction in Philadelphia shipyards.
I love the combination of the story. So you really get like the any such duty as required. You know, they do an amphibious operation. They fight as infantry. They fight as artillerists. Yeah. Uh, so for the rest of the war, is there really any land presence of the Marines, or is it primarily maritime?
So it's primarily maritime. The whole time this is going on, we have Marines fighting at sea, and they fight at sea from all the way from the very first days of the revolution to the final days. But there are some limited naval campaigns in which we fight ashore as well. A couple of examples. One of the young midshipmen that was on that original raid to New Providence, his name was John Trevett. Well, Trevett was eventually commissioned as a Marine officer, and in 1778, he went back down to New Providence and captured Fort Nassau a second time. And that's a great story in itself. He captured several British ships. He does it with a small detachment of Marines, like 17 Marines. He uses guise and deception to make the people of Nassau and the militiamen think that he has like a 200-man company occupying Fort Nassau. It's like 17 guys. So it's a great story. I write about that in my next book, which I'm going to title America's Marines, The War at Sea and the Penobscot Expedition of 1779. Another thing that the Marines do is they provide ambitious and aggressive naval officers like John Paul Jones with the ability to conduct raids on the British homelands. And so in 1778, we start to send U.S. warships and privateers into British home waters. And John Paul Jones is just wreaked havoc on the place from a information warfare and psychological warfare perspective. He conducts raids ashore in Scotland and Ireland using Continental Marines. And when they do that, that creates this uproar that the British Commonwealth now feels that they're not safe, which causes strategically the British to bring more forces away from North America to protect the homeland. So again, a far more impactful operation than the limited resources that we use to do it. And then the final campaign that I'll mention is the Penobscot Expedition. So everyone's familiar with New England. And I mentioned Nova Scotia. What you don't know is that Nova Scotia translates to New Scotland. So you have New England, you have New Scotland. And what happened during the war is the American patriots forced all the loyalists out of the colonies. The British put them in Nova Scotia. But Nova Scotia is a small island and does not have the resources, the lodging, or the economy to support these tens of thousands of loyalists that showed up. So the British actually invade what then was northern Massachusetts, today is the state of Maine, at Penobscot Bay to create New Ireland. It was going to be a new colony called New Ireland, and they were going to push all the loyalists to go occupy it. They successfully conduct this operation, and they create a fort on a peninsula in the middle of Penobscot Bay, and it's called Fort George. Well, Massachusetts at the time is up in arms over this because that land belongs to them. So they create an armada of 42 ships to go up there and oust the British out of their homeland. And those 42 ships were a combination of privateers, state Navy ships, and there were 3 continental ships. The Providence, the Defense, and the frigate Warren, which was one of the 13 original frigates constructed as per the Continental Congress. Remember the guy who I said was the CEO of the first flagship Alfred? His name was Dudley Saltonstall. He is now the commanding officer of the frigate Warren. And because that's the largest and most senior ship, he is named as the commodore of this fleet of 42 ships. And the Warren's Mardet commander was a guy named John Welsh. Captain John Welsh was one of the first 3 commissioned officers along with Samuel Nicholas. Welsh had done several deployments. He was part of the New Providence raid. He was part of several other ship battles. He was actually captured, did time in a British prison, escaped with the guy who would become his XO, William Hamilton, and is sent back to the United States. And he's now finds himself as the Mardezio on the warrant. Because he's on the Commodore's ship, he is the senior Marine. He is the senior Marine for the expedition. And then the ground force that was created for this expedition was all Massachusetts state militia under a guy named Brigadier General Lovell. This Penobscot expedition that occurred in 1779 was an absolute failure. It was the greatest naval defeat in American history for 164 years, all the way up to Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. We lost every one of those 42 ships. And it was because of the inept leadership of Commodore Saltonstall and Brigadier General Lovell. But the only shining light in this whole expedition was every time the Marines led an effort. So when the fleet first showed up, they were going to do an amphibious assault to land on that peninsula and capture Fort George. The weather didn't permit it. The Commodore pulled back. It was John Welsh who came up with the idea. He said, let's capture this smaller island called Nautilus Island or Bank Island first. And the Continental Marines under Welsh do an amphibious assault. They capture this island. They capture a British artillery position, which can do flanking fire into the fleet as it's trying to conduct its amphibious assault. So that's win one for the Marines. Win two is they actually do conduct an assault across the rocky beaches of Penobscot Bay, and the Marines lead an effort. They assault up a 200 to 300 foot steep cliff where the British are on top of the cliff, firing plunging fire down onto the beaches as the Marines with some militiamen assault. The Marines climb their way literally hand over foot up this 200-foot cliff, led by Captain John Welsh. And Welsh and his XO, Lieutenant Hamilton, get shot and killed in the assault up the cliff. But the Marines continue to push, and they capture the high ground, forcing the British to fall back. The Marines capture another artillery position on the flank of the Americans, and they are pushing forward towards Fort George, leaving 8 casualties behind. 200 plus Marines are now involved in this assault with militiamen. They're on the verge of capturing Fort George. The British commander is literally standing there with his hand on the lanyard to pull the surrender flag down. And right at that decisive moment, General Lovell, the ground commander, says, "Stop all movement. We're going under siege." What? You know, he threw away the victory that was theirs to be had. And when he did that, he placed Fort George under siege. His forces were undisciplined. They were young boys, old men, invalids. And basically, they give the British enough time to send a reinforcing fleet down from New York. And when the Commodore sees this fleet of frigates coming from the Royal Navy, he tells his fleet, every man for himself. And we wind up destroying our own damn fleet. 2 of the ships got captured. Only 1 of the 42 ships tried to fight back. And the Marines now have to escape by foot across the northern Massachusetts wilderness and eventually find their way back to Boston on foot. It's an utter defeat. But again, the only shining light in the whole expedition is when the Marines did their duty, and they did it well, and they succeeded in their part of the evolution. So it's an important Marine Corps story to tell. Americans don't tell the story because we got our butts whooped because of inept leadership at the senior levels.
So that's fascinating. Speaking of stories that we tell, your book, Washington's Marines, I think there's an interesting dynamic that maybe doesn't parallel what we're seeing today, but I think there's just a ton of lessons that can be learned. What are some of your thoughts, being that the paradigm's a little different, whereas the Continental Marines were sort of the the salty soldiers at sea that were coming to reinforce the greener units. We don't necessarily have that now. After the long war, speaking of time and service expirations, we have a lot of combat vets that are leaving either through, pursuing education, life in the private sector, retirement, you name it. And so our force right now is, fairly green. We don't have a lot to lean on as far as, that crusty gunnery sergeant that's been at war since he's a corporal, or that battalion commander that was a platoon commander, during the invasion of Iraq. And now we're looking at, obviously there's a ton of Marines right now who are on call, ready to go, due to what can we draw from the experience, from your book in particular, but from the experience of the Colonial Marines that will help us in this time where we're sort of in flux and there's a bit of a vacuum of a combat experience, Marines, as we're about to go forward.
Yeah, to reinforce your point, Vic, I just went by the Veterans Center here at Liberty University the other day, and there's representatives from all of the services. The head of the Veterans Council is a former Marine sergeant, and we're getting ready to do the Marine Corps cake cutting ceremony in front of 16,000 Liberty University students. So you can never get the recruiter man out of me. We're making sure we tell the Marine Corps story, and we're going to recruit more Marines out of that group. But to the point is, I sat down with a large group of these veterans in the Vet Center, and I asked, how many of you are combat vets? Not one. To your point, that generation is already transitioning out of the Marine Corps. So I will tell you, you do what Marines have always done in the interwar years. You read, you study, you rehearse, you train, you do war games, you talk to combat vets, you do everything you can to replicate the most realistic combat conditions to prepare our Marines for that next battle. And there's no doubt in my mind that they'll achieve it. But, it's the other aspect of this is one of the intangibles about Marines is that lore of the Marine Corps, that lore of Semper Fidelis, that history and tradition that is so important that we will never let those Marines down who went before us. So you have to know who those Marines were and the challenges they faced and what they went through. Because when you learn about the Chosin Reservoir and the conditions that Marines fought in at that time, and you're out in the battlefield and it's a little cold and you're uncomfortable, all you have to do is put that in perspective to what Marines who went before us have gone through. And the fact that we have to live up to that legacy and write that next chapter of our illustrious Corps' history. And they should be proud of that fact that they have the opportunity to do that they've been counted, that they've earned that title Marine. So those lessons are there. It's after action reports, it's the history books. Again, it's understand the difference between training and education. In the Marine Corps, we train for certainty. Assembly and disassembly of the weapon system, you do that so many times it becomes muscle memory. That's training. You train to understand patterns on the battlefield to develop what we call the coup d'oeil, right? That sixth sense of what's going to happen on the battlefield. The more reps and sets that you get of doing that in training, the more that you will be prepared for that when it happens for real. And I'll give you an example of that. When I took my battalion through Mojave Viper in 29 Palms prior to going to Iraq, they did such a great job of simulating realistic environment that we would operate in Iraq. When we got to Iraq, I felt like I was back in 29 Palms. They had done such a good job with it. My hat's off to them for doing that. And I know Training Education Command is doing a great job in providing the most realistic training we can. But we train for certainty. We educate for uncertainty. We train and produce flexible, adaptable problem solvers. And I will say that no matter how much you prepare for war, you can never prepare for everything. And so being that flexible, adaptable problem solver and not being overwhelmed mentally when the fog of war is kicking you in the shin, that's the mark of success. It's our small unit leaders who understand that stuff happens and you just got to roll with the punches. What are you going to do about it? Adapt, overcome, and accomplish the mission. And when you combine all of that, the history, tradition, the institutional culture of the Marine Corps, Semper Fidelis, years of training, so you instinctively understand that muscle memory and seeing those patterns happen, and then you educate our people to be flexible, adaptable problem solvers, we're the most fierce fighter on the in warfare today. And so I'm absolutely confident that our Marines will continue to do well on battlefields and continue to do us all proud and continue to write our legacy.
Yeah, absolutely, sir.
Thank you, General. So do you have any other, as we start to wrap up this interview, are you working on anything that you'd like to, give us a little preview for?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm working on the next chapter of Washington's Marines. I believe I'm going to call it America's Marines, and it will cover what didn't get covered in Washington's Marines, and that is the war at sea. It's Marines fighting on the oceans and fighting in the brown water and the Delaware River, the Penobscot River, the James River. And it's going to, just like Washington's Marines, the second half of it focused on the Battle of Trenton and the 10 Crucial Days. The second half of America's Marines, rather, will focus on the Penobscot expedition that I described.
Awesome, sir. And where can folks find you? Obviously, we could go to the liberty.edu website and see you there at the Helms School of Government. But are you on LinkedIn or any
Yeah, I'm
your
on
website?
LinkedIn, Facebook. My personal contact info is on those both of those websites or platforms as well.
Okay, fantastic, sir. Well, sir, we really appreciate this time. I can't wait for your next book. Congratulations on Washington's Marines. You can also find it for our folks who spend a lot of time in traffic. It's on Audible. The narrator's very good. So that's also another avenue to dive into this story. But thank you so much, sir, for spending time with us and for really helping us understand the foundations of the Marine Corps and where we come from.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I really applaud the Marine Corps Association and the two of you for telling our 250-year story, because there's an awful lot to cover there. That's going to be a great,
Absolutely.
It's going to be a great journey.
Well, this is a wonderful kickoff. So if it's like this, this is going to be a great year.
Right. Well, God bless you all, and Semper Fidelis.
God bless, sir. Semper Fi.
Libraries serve as essential research, educational, and quality of life infrastructure to the military. They provide a place to find answers, relax, and connect with peers. The Department of Defense libraries, with over 340 locations globally, offer a variety of services to support their unique communities. Let's honor these incredible librarians and library technicians who provide these services during Military Libraries Week from November 10 through 16.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. You have heard the voices or contributions from Major Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Litchman, William Truding, and our guest. Ty Frazier is the editor, sound engineer, and technical producer. The Marine Corps Association is not an agency of the U.S. government. The opinions expressed in this episode are the personal views of the participants and do not reflect the official position of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or the Marine Corps Association.